Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much for having me. I have the pleasure of presenting our work, which was kind of a survey, kind of a experimental, like probing into graph transformers. I wasn't 100% sure what the audience was going to be like, so I prepared a little primer on graph neural networks before we get started, because they are like graph transformers are heavily motivated by them. But from what I hear, this fits perfectly. Yes, also at this point, would like to mention my great co-authors, Michael and Ladislav, who also work, Mila, and also Chris, who did this postdoc there and is now my like the professor at my lab where I do my PhD. Yes, so let me get started. If my slide, yes. Great. So just a quick primer on graph neural networks for anyone who's never seen them. I'll keep it like super basic and just to motivate like the application of graph transformers when applying, like when learning on graphs. So this is just like I threw together this diagram just to quickly like visualize what's happening. So usually we'll build representations of like learning representations on top of nodes. These representations here are simplified, like simplicitly visualized with colors. Okay, so this is like the same representation, and then maybe this is a different vector or representation, for example. And then in each layer of the graph neural network, we are updating each node's representation based on the representation of its neighbors and its own representation. And that in terms of like in a more mathematical way, this looks like summing over the neighbors, summing up their representations times some weight matrix, and then adding that to like the feature itself, so the feature we're updating times another weight matrix, and then we're passing that whole thing through an MLP, and that's one layer of the graph neural network. That's how we'll update a representation. And this process is often also called message passing. There's some ambiguity, what is what exactly, but I'll stick with the message passing for now. As I said, so features are aggregated from neighbors, and of course also important from oneself, like from the node itself, and then updated, as I said. And this kind of message passing is deeply connected to the Weisfeld-Lehmann test for distinguishing non-isomorphic graphs, in case you've heard of this. And that's actually an open problem, so we don't even know, if I recall correctly, whether this can be solved in polynomial time. So we don't know, but so far open problem, but there's a deep connection between the types of graphs that graph neural networks can distinguish versus the types of graphs that Weisfeld-Lehmann can distinguish. And just as a kind of a to get you a feeling for this connection, it's actually that there's a lot of graphs, a lot of examples where you can show that a standard graph neural network cannot distinguish the graphs. So this is what we in the graph learning community mostly refer to as when we mean expressivity, just how many graphs can we distinguish. And there's inherent limitations of standard graph neural networks, but they actually come with far greater problems than just distinguishing, because it turns out you can kind of patch this by adding some bells and whistles to the graph neural network itself. But there's also some like inherent problems that are a bit more challenging, and that's what we'll get into now. The first one is it's a problem called oversmoothing that has been discovered in, let's say, I think this was the first paper that I could find on the topic. And it basically they figured out that if they stack a lot of layers on their GNN, then the performance degraded over many layers. And so like a standard neural network approach to solving this is like adding residual connections, and a lot of that has been done. But there remains a problem with a specific type of graphs, so-called heterophilic graphs. And I brought an example here on the right side. This is essentially the case where we'll assume that the feature vectors of green and orange are very far apart in feature space. And what we usually like to do in graph neural networks is we like to smooth between neighbors. So smoothing or aggregating neighbors locally is more or less the same thing. But as it turns out, if your neighbors are all much different to your own representation, you'll not get a lot out of this aggregation. And what's even worse is that the features of the orange features and the green features kind of blend together. And what ends up is that all features kind of go closer together. The more layers you stack up, the more smoothing happens. And so this is one of the crucial problems of graph neural networks, and there's a lot of work on mitigating this issue. But remember, so this is definitely caused by connections between neighbors. So if we could, for example, smooth between those two and those two, but ignore those orange ones, then that would actually solve the problem, or at least would help mitigate it. So inherent problem here is that graph neural networks aggregate locally. So that's the first one, and the other one has kind of a similar name, which is why they often appear in pairs in the literature. It's called the oversquashing problem. The oversquashing problem is, I wouldn't say complementary, but it's kind of a flip side of the coin. Has been discovered in 2021, so quite recently actually, and it's related not to deep GNNs necessarily, but to deep graphs. So I've actually let me actually show you the graph first. So this example is a tree graph, and these dots kind of refer to like an increase in depth and kind of like exponentially. So this could be like the 8th or 9th like depth of this tree. And there's a task called neighbors match that these authors here proposed, where you have a specific node here at the bottom, or actually all of them, and they carry some information. And the job of the network is to pass this information up to the root node. But because GNNs aggregate information locally, what happens is that they have to squash the entire information from the entire tree. So their receptive field, so to speak, is the entire tree, and it grows exponentially with depth. So at some depth, it will lose information. And another way to phrase the oversquashing problem is that long distance nodes lose the ability to have impact on each other. So the signal coming from this node to this node is actually very weak, and that can cause problems in applications where information needs to be transported through a network over long distances. All right, so this is just a quick motivation for why then graph transformers were introduced, apart, of course, from the obvious successes in other domains, such as language and vision. People quickly realized graph transformers come with some really nice properties that help avoid these issues. The general idea is just to use the kind of standard dot product attention over node features to go from a local to a global receptive field, which means nothing else than instead of aggregating over only your neighbors, you kind of have just use the attention matrix as a soft links between nodes, and have like a complete graph that just has like that does aggregation based on the strength of the link. And the hope is that this enables long-range dependencies. So these are the things where your signal can reach far through a graph. And they're also designed to, or we hopefully can reduce oversmoothing, oversquashing with them, because of the problems that I explained, right? So those problems are inherently because of the local aggregation nature of GNNs. And so by going to a global receptive field, by just aggregating from everywhere, we hope to be able to kind of avoid the oversmoothing, oversquashing issues. But there's also questions around building graph transformers. So it seems not very true. It appears that it's not very trivial to build one that is, for example, universal, because that would also mean it can approximate the graph isomorphism problem, and we don't even know whether we can solve that yet. So the question is, how do we actually induce structural bias into the model? Because if we don't have it, if it doesn't know about, so of course it aggregates globally, but it still needs information about the graph structure. Otherwise, it just considers a set of nodes. And the inherent motivation of doing graph learning is to also infer information from the structure, so the way that the representations are connected. And so this is I would say the biggest challenge in designing graph transformers. And then there's also a small downside, which if you're a transformer, like if you're used to transformers, you're maybe not even thinking about this much. But as I heard you also discussing efficient transformers, so the runtime of a GNN is in O of the number of edges. And as we move to standard attention, we suffer from like a squared complexity in the number of nodes. So N here refers to the number of nodes, E to the number of edges in the graph. So links, essentially. All right. Yes, this is a slide that I just want to quickly step through. It's, I guess, more targeted to people who are already familiar with GNNs. It's essentially a slide that tries to convince you that graph attention is doing nothing else than message passing, but globally. So I titled this global weighted message passing. Essentially, we have a similar form than we had before. We're updating our feature based on a sum, but we have two differences. One is the attention score that kind of weights the different components instead of just summing them up. And the other part is that we're not going over the neighborhood anymore. We're going over the entire set of nodes of the graph. And then the attention scores are just computed. I've kind of written this here in this maybe kernel perspective, you could call it, but this is just standard softmax attention, like we also see here in the top right corner. All right. Good. Let's talk about the most important thing, strategies to introduce structural bias. By the way, I'm not so much talking yet about our survey, but our survey's point was also to kind of bring structure into all the different components that make graph transformers. So just see this as kind of extended preliminaries, and then the actual content of our paper will come in the second half. All right, so let me expand these actually quite from already from the start. There's three essential strategies to introduce structural bias into a transformer. One is the standard positional encoding that you also know from maybe language or vision. And it's just kind of a positional like information of a certain node. So where's the node in the graph? Now this is really hard because there's no canonical ordering in a graph, so it's not actually a sequence. So you can't just say it's at the first, second, third, fourth position, but you actually have to find a bit of a more like a kind of a workaround to describe position. The other is complements the positional encodings as structural encodings. So what does my environment look like? What kind of substructures am I immediately embedded in? For example, is a given node on a cycle graph, like a subgraph in the whole graph that we're looking at. And lastly, we have attention bias, so that's just like biasing attention before applying the softmax, where you can encode the relationship to other nodes, such as, for example, just simply the edge information. So simply saying these two nodes are connected, yes or no. But you can also do, for example, something like encode the distance between two nodes. And there's, I would say this one allows for the most, has the biggest design space and is very intuitive, but it comes with some downsides, and we'll discuss them also. All right, so let's go through some examples of what it can look like. An example for position encoding that is very popular is the Laplacian encoding. I will not go too much into detail what the graph Laplacian represents, but it is basically a function of the adjacency matrix. In fact, it's the degree matrix minus the adjacency matrix. Degree matrix is just a matrix that has the node degree on the diagonal, and you subtract the adjacency matrix, so that has ones and zeros depending on whether two nodes are connected. And we are doing an eigencomposition of this matrix and embedding the eigenvectors and eigenvalues to create the positional encoding. So the thing is, we don't just do this like randomly. We do this because we know that the eigenvectors and eigenvalues of the graph Laplacian, this is like a known theoretical result from the graph theory field. They hold a lot of structural information about the graph, and they're very information rich. And we hope that this sort of helps us to induce structure well into the graph. And actually, there's also a kind of proof, or at least there's a paper showing, this paper, in fact, that Laplacian encodings naturally generalize the sine and cosine positional encodings that we know from language or vision. Yes, so this is just another description of what we're doing. We're embedding the eigenvectors, eigenvalues into as a positional encoding, and then append that to the node features. I guess you're all familiar with how that works, so I will not go too deep into that technicality. An example for a structural encoding is based on, like, this is a very popular one, where you're starting at a node and you're doing a lot of random walks. Random walk is just going from one node, going to a next node or to yourself by some probability. And then we are repeating this for a certain length and count essentially how many times we return to the starting position. And this information we embed. And that gives us a lot of information about nearby structures. Although I have to admit that I at least haven't seen a fully convincing sort of study about like the exact information that this gives us. But I think it makes intuitively, it makes a lot of sense. And there's also proofs that this can actually improve the expressivity of a GNN or a transformer. Obviously, you can also append a positional encoding to a GNN node feature. There's nothing prohibiting you from that. Yes, as I said, we collect many random walks and then encode the return probability, so probability of returning to the starting node, and concatenate that to the node feature. And finally, and just this one, just very briefly, is just like attention bias is the idea of encoding some kind of relationship between nodes and then adding that before applying the softmax. But after we've done the Q times K matrix multiplication, we then also add a bias term. And this gives us a lot of design freedom in what kind of things we encode, including features on edges, the adjacency between nodes, the distance, etc. And this approach can obviously also be used in conjunction with position encoding, structural encodings. And there's also some work on, so this paper, I would say, introduced them first for graphs, and they also experimented with different settings and had some very good results. All right. So now we are starting to get into, kind of in time, I would say, we're starting to get into the survey part. So up until now was just, as I said, extended preliminaries. And now we're diving into the survey part of our paper, where we are building a taxonomy of the different developments in the graph transformer field. Let me just, sorry. Yes, so the different components that we have for that like emerge in a graph transformer field, and we divided this into 4 sections, and I will basically walk you through those sections. You will always also see the part of our taxonomy in the top right, just for you to orient yourself on the slide. We'll start with the encodings. As I said, they have very high importance because it's all about introducing structure into the graph transformer. As we've seen, there are various variants available, but we also see that they're task dependent. So on some tasks, the Laplacian position encodings work better. On other tasks, the random walk structural encodings work better. And so basically the biggest challenge in designing them, apart from obviously making them less task dependent, so more general encodings are important, but also respecting invariance, equivariance, of the encodings with respect to the node ordering, which is just meaning to say, I haven't formally defined this, but it just means to say that that it's important that these are not things that are depending on some fixed order of nodes in a graph. So it has to translate from graph to graph, so to speak. It has to be relative from a node's perspective, such as the random walk is relative, or such as the Laplacian, like the eigenvector, is relative. So it doesn't depend on a specific node ordering. That's all that wants to say. And then here again we see these two examples that I brought that are, I would say, the most popular and are the most widely used. But there's some variations, and it is yet to be. I would say there's yet to be a position encoding that is really convincing across tasks. So that's kind of a takeaway. All right. Next up, input features. We've already seen the sort of standard graph. So that's the graph that I used as an example a couple of times. We have nodes and we have edges and we have corresponding features. So sometimes we also have features between edges. For example, in a molecular graph, such a feature could determine the kind of bond that two atoms have, as an example. But then there's also a huge field called geometric deep learning, and that is considering also geometric information, such as the 3D coordinates of nodes. So I kind of try to embed them here into a 3D coordinate system, but also angles between nodes. So this is already involving relationships between three nodes already. So while edges were just between two nodes, now we already have input features that relate up to three nodes with each other. And so that's sort of like that's sort of the most basic distinction that you can make. There's transformers specifically for 3D for 3D graphs, and they come with their own challenges, but I will not go too deep into that for now. All right. Another important thing that we kind of make stood out is the type of input tokens. So far we've seen mostly the nodes as input tokens. That's how also GNNs usually work. That the representations are built exclusively on the nodes. But other interactions are possible and have also been explored. So in the graph transformer literature, there's combinations of nodes and edges. By the way, remember also that the token type also determines the kind of interactions that we can have. And this might also be task dependent. So on one task, it might make sense to have, going back to the molecular example, nodes interact with nodes. In other applications or in other tasks, it might be better to have edges interact with nodes, for example, certain bond types with the corresponding atoms. And there's also a proof available that combining node and edge tokens, so also representing edges as tokens, can give you increased expressivity. And the last one I would like to mention, because it's also very close to the way that a vision transformer works, is to partition the graph into patches, or we would call them in the graph learning community subgraphs, by coarsening or partitioning the graph, and then usually also applying some kind of feature extractor on top. In the maybe vision domain, you would maybe apply a CNN on top of the patches before feeding them into transformer. And so that's also been explored in the graph learning domain, where a GNN has then been applied to the different subgraphs. And then we pull that into the features for the patches, and we use that for graph level predictions by feeding them into a transformer. All right. The fourth part of the survey is about propagation, which I'll get into. So I've already mentioned, so the standard way of applying the transformer in all domains is the standard attention. And that is also, like I call it here, the pure transformer, just meaning the original transformer, let's say. But then also we can modify this standard attention by adding a bias, as we've seen. This is also a popular way of encoding relationships, and we're essentially conditioning the attention matrix with some kind of structural relationship between nodes or between nodes and edges. Again, we've seen now that the token space can be larger than just nodes, so it could also be subgraphs. Then we would maybe condition the attention towards structural relation between subgraphs and so on. Then there's also been explorations to kind of go back to the roots of GNNs and again do sparse attention, so not do the full n by n attention that, as we know, is very costly. So there's been kernelization approaches that maybe not this one, but there's also been ways to apply the performer, the linear attention performer to graphs. That has been done. There's different techniques that are more specific to graphs, such as this one. And then there's also the X-former, a recent paper that introduces like a sparse type of propagation where we're not operating on the input graph structure, but we're also not operating on all nodes by all nodes, but rather on a different kind of structure that the details I will omit here because they're not really relevant. The takeaway should be that there's actually a huge like design space explored with regards to the different ways to modify the propagation. But of course, they all come with their benefits and their downsides. For example, the attention bias doesn't allow us to apply something like the performer, and so we cannot, for example, meaningfully reduce the memory and time complexity of the attention mechanism when we apply attention bias, which I would say is its biggest downside, because other than that it is very intuitive to encode relationships, as that is really what structure, like edges fundamentally represent connections between nodes, so it makes sense to encode that. But as I said, so this also comes with some downsides in terms of scalability and like maybe generality, or generality is the wrong word. It's not pure transformer anymore. So if there's a new innovation for transformers, it cannot necessarily be applied because we are actually modifying the attention mechanism. Okay. And lastly, there's also, of course, hybrid models that combine transformers with GNNs to get each their respective power. And there's also and then essentially combine their representations in some kind of way. One popular one is to apply a GNN and then a transformer. So this is also very similar to the approach where we've seen that we extract patches, apply a GNN, and then a transformer. But also a recent paper by two of my co-authors called general powerful scalable, I think, I hope, graph transformer. That is more or less a framework for composing the best out of the space into creating a state-of-the-art transformer. And they hold a state-of-the-art on many graph benchmarks, and kind of showed that at least for now, pure transformers on graphs are not yet competitive with combining them also with GNNs. So, right, the local message passing does come with a few benefits such that it naturally incorporates the structure of the graph. And finally, a small summary of our taxonomy. Just those four parts that are split out. Of course, there's a lot more to find in the paper. I'll also link it in the end, and I think it should also be in the Google Docs, or Google Sheets, like the link to the paper. But I've just given you the highlights here. All right, and for the second part, this should be a more fun one. This is also what we build our Twitter thread on mostly. Is that we set out to do some myth busting, because the graph transformer field is fairly young. And there's a lot of papers and a lot of claims flying around, and people claiming, things like that I said in the beginning, like graph transformers can just naturally solve the oversquashing, oversmoothing problem, and so on. And we kind of tackled that, kind of building up 4 myths that we want to analyze, not necessarily bust. So the questions that we pose are GTs, graph transformers here, of course, theoretically more expressive than GNNs? So can they distinguish more graphs? Which is, like, of course, an ambiguous question, because we've seen that there's not just one type of GT. So different GTs with different bells and whistles might be more theoretically expressive. But here we're talking really about the base, like the base model of just applying attention on top of node features. The second question is, can the existing approaches for incorporating graph structure, do they actually work? So can we actually find evidence that they do recover structure, or is there something else to their success than finding like that the recovering structure in the between nodes or edges and so on? The third question is, does the global attention reduce oversmoothing? So that's the first one, and the second one is then, can they help with oversquashing? At least better than GNN models. It should be clear that also a graph transformer is not able to, squash an exponentially growing receptive field into one feature representation, but it might be able to selectively choose the kind of nodes that it wants to receive information from, and kind of set all the other attention scores to 0, thereby reducing the effective receptive field to only a few nodes. That's kind of the hope. Okay, and this is semi-serious. We award badges depending on how much the myth has been busted or confirmed, and also adding a plausible that is just where we're not 100% sure. But don't overinterpret this. So this is more for fun. And in the paper, we're much more serious about answering these questions. All right. So let's start with the first part, the expressivity question. That was quickly answered by just looking at the existing literature and kind of parsing that and bringing that together. First of all, a transformer without any structural information, as I said, just acts on sets, so it cannot capture any structure that is maybe not already contained in the node features. That could, of course, happen, but any kind of connectivity structure it cannot recover because it's simply not aware of it. And so it's pretty clear that the expressive power of a graph transformer is determined solely by the positional structural encodings. As I already said, so like finding a graph transformer that is universal, so maximally expressive, can distinguish all graphs, is as hard as the graph isomorphism problem, and we don't currently know whether that's solvable. But at least it is a really hard problem, because I think it exists for, I actually don't know how long, but it reaches far back into the last century. So this is kind of our finding. Simply, like, no, GTs are not more expressive than GNNs. They're actually they're more similar than different, as I also tried to convince you in the beginning, and that's also been confirmed in our findings. Next up, we try to figure out whether graph transformers can, whether they're structurally aware, we call this, so whether they can recover certain types of structures. What we did for this is we designed 3 tasks. We designed 3 tasks from easy to hard, and this difficulty is basically determined by the performance of an existing GNN. So this GIN model here is a very popular, very famous GNN model, and we ran it on 3 different tasks and kind of grouped them by how hard it was for the GNN to solve. These are all accuracies, so the higher the better. The first task we call edges is just about recovering whether two nodes are connected by an edge. It's very straightforward. And in fact, the GNN can solve this perfectly, while the vanilla transformer without any structural information does almost not better than random on this task, which is to be expected. We also find that both the Laplacian and random walk encoding are very, very good for recovering this task, and also the Graphomer, which is, I don't think I've explicitly mentioned it, but it is a model that uses the attention bias. So that's one that we kind of grouped it by one doing positional, one doing structural, one doing attention bias, and then comparing them. And all of them almost perfectly solve this task, or at least as good as the GNN. The next task is about recovering triangles in a graph. So simply just counting the number of triangles that exist in a graph, which is a task that the GNN is semi-good at least with some failure rate. And we also have a distinction here between small graphs and large graphs. Large here means, by the way, that during training, we only see small graphs, and then during test time, this is what this refers to, we either see small graphs or we see large graphs. And the two things that we found is that, first of all, structural encoding and attention bias perfectly solve this task, while the GNN is struggling. Also struggling is the transformer with Laplacian encoding. So this is also what I mean with task dependent. Some structures it can distinguish better than others, but across the board, when we move to larger graphs, they start failing. And this is not really related to transformers, we think. It's just an interesting thing. We found out that the out of distribution generalization to large graphs seems to be not happening, at least on that task. And lastly, CSL, those are, I will not go into too much detail, also in the interest of time, but they are really hard for standard GNNs. In fact, they cannot distinguish those types of graphs at all. And we see that across the board, the transformers perform very well. Although the attention bias is not as good, which is related to the fact that these graphs, that it does not possess the information necessary to distinguish all graphs, but we can clearly see that the transformers perform much better on the GNN. And so this is good news in terms of structural awareness of the GNNs. And so we say this is confirmed. Just a quick one. I will not go too deep into these numbers. Actually regret putting the entire table here, but just as a quick message, the question was whether attention can reduce oversmoothing. So we picked out the 6 most common heterophilic data sets, and we benchmarked our transformer on all of them, compared them to a standard GNN baseline. This time is called the GCN, is also a popular model. And we figure out that the transformers beat the baseline, so they beat the GNNs, but they are far behind the specialized state-of-the-art on these data sets. And so we think, yes, it can definitely help avoid oversmoothing, but this requires more research to dissect, and also to figure out how transformers can do even better on these data sets. And the last one is regarding the oversquashing. We did this very simple. I told you in the beginning about the neighbors match problem. This was the exponentially growing tree, and we just evaluated this on ourselves. Here in green, you see the transformer, and basically our findings are, as we increase the depth, the transformer continues to perform very well in this task, whereas the GNNs start to fail up to some depth, which is an extension of the results from this original paper to transformers. But note also that this is a synthetic data set, so we are very confident for this data set, but not in general that transformers can avoid oversquashing. So we say it is important to investigate this on real world data or more complex problems involving the oversquashing. But in general, we say, yeah, this is confirmed. So it definitely performs better on this specific task. All right. Last but not least, this is a bonus slide. I'm very sorry for, I'm kind of in time, so perfect for the last slide. We have tried to take a pre-trained graph transformer and interpret the attention. For example, figure out something like can we extract any meaningful patterns out of the graph transformer attention, and whatever we looked for, whether it was 3D distances or these kind of things, or even just adjacency, we weren't able to find them in the attention matrix. And looking into other fields that tried this before, such as in the language domain, they faced similar issues, and they opted for instead designing benchmarks that were able to dissect attention instead of actually looking at the attention and interpreting it directly. And so we suggest to follow this direction also for graph transformers. I say bonus because this is not really a main result. This is just more kind of an opinion, but also we think very important to keep an eye on how interpretable GTs are and how we can understand their inner workings and why they perform so much better than GNNs. Part of that could be because of oversquashing, oversmoothing problems being partly alleviated, but remains a very interesting problem and something that captivates me in my research. And I hope that I could at least somewhat convey the whole lot of different considerations that go into this, but yes. So we say busted in terms of interpreting attention, but again, the suggestion goes to design suitable benchmarks that can where we can figure out more. Yes, so that basically concludes this. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention. I hope that even if you hadn't had prior experience with graph learning, I could at least give you some intuition of what the issues are in the field and how graph transformers are somewhat helping, but there's also a lot of open questions. And with this, I would like to kind of give you the opportunity to ask questions or discuss with me. Yes, thank you for your attention.
So I guess if anybody has questions, feel free to ask them. Meanwhile, I will stop the recording. Thank you.